Hello again, this is John Burroughs. I am going to proceed with chapter 64 of my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. The name of the chapter is Riding Shotgun. I remember Hank telling me to forget everything I had learned in technician training and pole climbing school when I returned. He said that the real world is entirely different from the sterile environment that I had just experienced. He completely marginalized the importance of the training. I found out that as time passed, he was correct. This was the week that I would ride with a different technician each day in order to learn different styles and approaches as to how the job would be done. In most cases, when a van went out with two technicians, it was because loads were often distributed geographically, and in rare circumstances, a certain territory might have workloads where the majority of the load required two techs. One would do certain functions of the job while the other tech worked on different parts of the job, so the job would be completed in an expedient manner without sacrificing quality. This week, however, I was riding along to see how each tech would perform all the steps of the job, from beginning to completion. The first guy I rode with was Mike M. Mike was a big, broad-shouldered Italian guy with a personality and outlook on life that immediately grabbed you and made it impossible for you to dislike him. He told me the men in his family had had a history of heart disease, and he had a blood pressure kit that he always kept in his van and would periodically check his blood pressure. He is someone I will never forget and always remember and respect the genuineness of his friendship. There will be more about him later in the book and a section for the people in my life that touched me in a way that led to personal discovery and an occasional epiphany. Hank did not exaggerate when he told me the real world of a telephone tech would be different from how we were trained. Mike said to me as we were heading toward what I thought would be our first job, he said, "We have to make a quick stop before arriving at our first job." He said this as he made a right turn into a driveway of a strip mall. He pulled into a parking space reasonably close to an International House of Pancakes, and I could see 4 or 5 other phone vans parked sporadically around the restaurant. He turned off the ignition, placed cones around the van, then looked side at me and said, "Come on. You know as well as I do that breakfast is the most important meal of the day." We sat at a table next to a few other guys in our crew, and we all had breakfast. It was enjoyable not only because of the food, but it was obvious that this particular crew had a special bond and closeness that I was never to find again in my career at Pacific Bell. We would lovingly insult each other, and that created a special mood to start the day off with. As Mike and I left the restaurant to finally head to our first job, Mike said, with a sarcastic look all over his face, "I felt it as my duty as your mentor for the day that I make sure you understand that lunch is the second most important meal of the day." I shook my head and laughed, but by the end of the day, I learned about the importance of pride in your work and, even more valuable, the culture of Public Communications Department. The following day, I rode with Steve L. Like the previous day, breakfast was a prerequisite. Steve and Mike were very close friends. Steve attended my high school a few years after I did, and we found that we both knew some of the same people. Steve was an extremely confident, almost cocky person. Sometimes he appeared to be aloof. Like every single guy around Steve's age, we all had certain personality traits that contributed to an image that we wanted to portray. The Steve I got to know over the years was actually an extremely compassionate, intelligent person that I grew to have tremendous respect for over the years. I received a phone call from my second wife's place of employment that she had been transported to the hospital for possible heart conditions. I immediately headed to the hospital and waited patiently until I could see her and find out exactly what was ailing her. I was there for at least 3 hours. Steve and his future wife was the only member of our crew that showed up at the hospital that day, offering to help in any way that he could. It was very comforting, and his actions that day offered up a side of Steve that was rarely seen when the crew was all together. That act of kindness will forever be ingrained in my memory. Back to the first day when I first met Steve and rode with him to see how he went about completing his workload. He worked with incredible speed and tenacity on the job, almost as if attacking it. Considering the pace at which he worked, he would pay close attention to what he was doing, and the quality of his finished work was hard to match. After I left the crew for the trials of management, I lost contact with him. Mike promised me he would get Steve's phone number for me. I would be curious to find out what he did after moving to Washington. The entire time I knew him, I felt that he had the intelligence and natural ability to be in a leadership position anyway. On the third day, I rode with Steve K. Steve K was very close to Mike M. and Steve L. They were the three musketeers of our group. Their close friendship extended beyond the job, and they did a lot of things together after work and on the weekends. I had felt privileged that they accepted me as the fourth musketeer for the time we worked together. Although in my younger years I was a hippie, and as I grew older my attitude seemed to start leaning towards conservatism. I still smoked pot and did coke with my friends and other members of the crew. Mike M., Steve L., and Steve K. rarely took part in consuming any drugs. Their conservatism, or logic, if you will, was refreshing to me, and I realized that it was a sign that they were maturing slightly faster than the rest of us. Steve K. was a little bit more serious than Mike and Steve L. Steve K. would often go to breakfast, but on this particular day he did not. He was the most responsible guy in the crew, and I could see that he took our ride day very seriously. If I was going to partake in the traditional frowned upon, yet overlooked bad habits, it was not going to be on his watch. I know he received a lot of ribbing from the other guys. However, it was an admirable trait and served him well for the time that I knew him well. I think Steve had management ambitions, and I know he eventually became a manager. When it came to the quality of his work, it was superior to everyone else's, other than maybe Steve L's. He, like everyone else in the crew except one, had a great sense of humor, even if it was at his expense. He was amazing when it came to building whatever was needed for his house, and the final result was better than any professional could have done. I remember he built a storage loft in his garage, and it was impossible to tell that he added it on. It looked like it was already designed and came with the house. Steve thoroughly enjoyed conversations that were built around individual philosophy and opinion, and I miss those conversations immensely. There will be another story about Steve K. later. It needs to be told because it requires guts and determination from the both of us. Friday I would be out on my own, so on the prior Thursday Hank assigned me to ride with Gil S. In the beginning, after knowing him for a short time and due to our common affinity for marijuana, coke, and music, I was sure that I would end up closer to him than any of the other guys. On that day, I discovered that some years back, Gil was acquainted with Javier P., who played keyboards for a very popular local group called Fritz. Javier was a former keyboard player in a previous band of which I was a member. I will talk about Javier later, but it should be noted at this time that Fritz broke up when Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham left to join Mick Fleetwood and Christy McVie to start yet another version of Fleetwood Mac. The day riding with Gil turned out to be ordinary, but resulted in a friendship that was held together by our drug connections and the quality of their products. Gil was the first guy that I knew that owned a VCR, and often after work we would go to his house and get high and watch movie after movie on the VCR just because we felt it was a revolutionary new invention. Gil was also one of the few guys in the crew that would show up and support our band when we had gigs at the local dives. Our friendship was close until an incident happened a few years later that caused my respect for Gil to dwindle. A few years after that, my respect resurfaced. But during that time, he and his wife stuck their nose into some personal business of mine that eliminated any respect that I had for him. This will be touched on later also. There were other guys I have not mentioned but contributed their sense of humor and at the same time humility that made this a once-in-a-lifetime crew. In my life, I worked with many different groups of people where friendships flourished, but none of them compared to the closest friendship and love that the people in this particular group had for each other. I am truly grateful for whatever decision that I made that destined me to have the experience I shared with these guys. If there was any flaw at all, I would have to say that the experience ended much sooner than I liked.